I want to bring your attention to this, ready to print. It is available in English, free of charge, for all the conference participants. It's in English, it's only in English. A poster series on how is it humanly possible, history of the Holocaust. You can download at no expense at your different institutions and schools and use it as an educational tool. You go to the Vashem website, the conference website, you'll find the files there. It's only up during the conference. It's only for the conference participants. I have another cell phone here. Some must feel abandoned. So it's over here. And please reconnect. I'd like to introduce the head of our archives, Dr. Haim Gertner. Haim has been director of the Vashem Archives Division and the Fred Hillman Chair for Holocaust Documentation since 2008. In this capacity, he's leading an extensive project to collect all historical and personal Holocaust-related documentation and to make it openly accessible to the public through an innovative amalgamation of content and technology. He also serves as a partner and consultant on projects aimed at providing access to digital humanities in Israel and around the world, and is among the leaders of the EHRI, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, a European Commission-sponsored project comprising 23 institutions from 17 countries that are working to develop a common research infrastructure for Holocaust documentation. Haim, please, and speak slowly.
I imagine that there is a memorial or a monument related to the Shoah that speaks to each of us more than others. I myself have 3 such memorials. 2 in Berlin and 1 here in Jerusalem. The first one is the well-known Empty Library, a memorial designed by Hillman in 1995. It is located in the Bebelplatz in central Berlin. On May 10, 1933, a public book burning ceremony took place in front of the Berlin University, and about 20,000 books written by Jewish authors or whose content was seen as a threat to Nazi ideology were thrown into the flames by the crowd, mostly university students. Similar ceremonies were held throughout Germany, spurred on by the Nazi regime. The monument is a subterranean 5-on-5 meter room, visible through its glass roof on the pavement, on the exact site of the book burning. The walls are covered with empty, white bookshelves, which could accommodate some 20,000 books. This empty, buried library represent the cultural hollowness, the gaping wound that was left in Germany and humanity after the book burning. So this is the first monument that I like. The second memorial that touched my heart is the less known Missing House, erected 5 years earlier in 1990. In the old Jewish quarter of Berlin on Grosse Hamburger Straße stands an apartment building that was destroyed in an aerial bombing in February 1945. The building was renovated and has today the appearance of normal building with 3 entrances, but the middle entrance is actually empty. The French artist Christian Boltanski and his students conducted research in the Berlin Municipal Archives and discovered that Jews had lived in this building. Boltanski mounted placards on the 2 empty walls. The placards resemble enlarged museum labels containing the names and professions of the former residents of this building and also dates. The later date is displaying usually the date of death, usually 1942 or 1943. The third memorial that touches my heart is located here at the very edge of the Yad Vashem campus, Bikat HaKeilot, the valley of the communities. The names of over 5,000 communities where Jews lived and were murdered during the Shoah are memorialized on stone in a maze walls and open spaces sunk in the ground in a typological structure of the map of Europe and North Africa. The architects, Lipa Yahalom and Dan Tzur, designed the valley as open, gapping graves, a metaphor for the chasm left in Europe with the destruction of the Jewish communities along with the cultural and spiritual life. For me, these memorials offer a challenging way of thinking about commemoration, about remembrance, and also about identity. I'm asking myself why these places speaks to me so much. And there are 2 reasons that I'm giving myself for that. Firstly, precisely because of the void. Suddenly, the entire street, Germany, all of Europe, changed their appearance and, in my imagination at least, become a sea of empty holes. The lack of material manifests in a most incredibly effective way the missing. These memorials create something through nothing. So this is the first reason. Secondly, the need to make an effort. The empty library, the missing house, and the value of the communities can easily be overlooked when passing by. A passerby who happens to encounter the square or the street or the gate to the valley and is unaware of the existence of these works is liable to carry on without taking notice. He might see them but would not wonder about their meaning and would continue on his way. But if he stops and recognizes what he's seeing, he becomes a participant. This diffuse bilateral memory affects me, because then I'm not passive. It allows my imagination and my heart to connect to the missing, to converse with it, to complete it and become a part of it. The void, החלל הפנוי, the vacant space, if you will, is exactly the place for creativity, for relevancy, the place where one may shape his own identity. This is exactly where the remaining artifacts may offer a meaningful content. Not the only one, but a very important one. An artifact may encapsulate an entire life. It may bring us much closer to the human face. Yad Vashem has attempted to collect everything that documents the Holocaust in Israel, at least. I'm speaking about originals. And for example, we launched 6 years ago a national last-minute campaign in order to collect personal items from the public with their stories, which gives the context. We are meeting thousands of people who donated until now more than 200,000 items. Diaries, documents, photographs, artifacts, art. We call this campaign Gathering the Fragments, לאסוף את השברים. We also walk outside of Israel and we map and scan millions of documents every year all over the globe. People from all over the globe are sending us also originals to Yad Vashem. The Yad Vashem archives contain today about 200 million pages of documentation and close to 500,000 photos. We collect survivor testimony, films, art, artifacts, and more. This comprises the largest collection in the world on the Holocaust. This is the moral and educational power, one of them, of the Yad Vashem collection, which is irreplaceable. And here is an example. The Yad Vashem archives, as I told you, contain hundreds of diaries like this one. We received it from Miss Ruth Tauber from Tel Aviv, who donated it to us a few years ago. The diary was written by her late husband, Faber Stauber, Rabbi Faber Stauber, who during the years 1942-1944 was an educator in an orphanage that he opened in the Mogilev-Podolsk ghetto in Romania. The orphanage was home to no less than 450 students, Jewish children. It took us a year to preserve the diary. And then we invited Ruth to see the results. She was very, very happy and became very emotional, as you may assume. At the end of the visit, she told me, Haim, you know, I have at home something else, but this is not important. But if you want, you may come. So when someone is telling us something like that, of course we are there. So a few days later, one of the members of the archives visited her place, and what she brought with her were those 2 notebooks, handmade, that she carried, that she kept all those years in her house. Actually, the notebooks, when we opened them, we realized that in there we have letters or notes that the children had compiled for her husband and why, because in January 1944 they succeeded somehow to get certificates for all of them. The local Lublin succeeded in doing so. So the orphanage was closed. All the children were sent to the land of Israel. So they wrote to him. He stayed with the rest of the educators. They wrote to him farewell letters in those notebooks. One of them, page number 10, is this. To the educator, Rabbi Tauber. One of them, Eliezer Gamberger, then 15 years old, wrote, הזיכרון הוא הגן עדן היחיד מאין אי אפשר לגרש את האדם. Memory is the only paradise from which one cannot be expelled. From your student, Eliezer Gamberger, Mogilev, January 13, 1944. We searched in the Yad Vashem Central Database of Shoah victims' names for a person named Eliezer Gamberger and found no person of that name. However, we did find a very similar name, Eliezer Dagan, not Gamberger, who had filled 2 pages of testimony about his parents, the Gambergers, Yente and Israel. An address, you may see, appear on the lower left side of the page, Shikun Tzamchanim 57, Ramat Gan. I was very curious, so I called. I used the local telephone directory, and they found the number of the Dagan family in Shikun Tzamchanim 57 in Ramat Gan. A lady answered, Ms. Dagan. I presented myself, and they asked, may I speak with Mr. Dagan? She told me no, unfortunately he passed away 7 years ago, what do you want? So I told her the story. So she told me, of course, it's my husband. He was an orphan in this orphanage. She knew the story by heart, but she had no clue that here in the Yad Vashem archives, we have something that her husband, her late husband, wrote during the days of his existence in the orphanage. Especially, she was moved, especially when we showed her the next notebook, and there, almost on the last page, there was a photo of the teacher and the class. This case may teach us an important lesson. What may appear to be unimportant to one person, in this case to the owner, she told me it is not important, may prove to be highly significant to another human being, a relative, a researcher, or the public at large. So collecting documentation in itself is an important and essential activity, but it is not enough. It is no less important to connect data and to give access to data. So So in Yad Vashem, we decided that our moral duty is to provide online access to the material and allow the public to read it and to use it. Because of this moral duty, we provide public access to our collections gradually via the internet more than a decade. It's an ongoing project, but a very successful one. So all this richness of data is indeed important, but it also brings with it new challenges and even frustration. And why? Because something very fundamental in the nature of memory of the past had changed. We were born, including me, I assume most of you, into a world where almost no event more sacred than the next. Archives and libraries collect everything, like us. Researchers research everything. Museums exhibit everything. The internet, more than all, offers up almost everything. The underlying assumption at the base of our perception is that potentially, at least, everything is equally important. I am saying this devoid of criticism or judgment. This is the reality in which we function today. This reality impairs the ability to make an event mythic, and weakens the ability to memorialize specific events. It is weakening our work as educators, I think. Or at least it has the risk to do so. So what do we do? When there is no sacred text, or hardly no sacred text, and when there is not one message, responsible discourse itself becomes important. When there is a discourse, something becomes yours. We have the urgency to collect, and we have to expose and to give access to all of what we have. But all that is still not enough, because we also need context. And for that, we need serious researchers and devoted, sensitive educators. Let me share with you a few examples. Tova and Menashe Teilblum met each other at the Bergen-Belsen DP camp. They decided to build a family together, so they used this unique tuba done there during the first days of the camp. It was cold, so Tova was knitting a sweater made of socks of Nazi officers. Here, she is wearing it in the camp. You see it in the photo. You see it from her daughters. This is part of her own, I would call it identity, professional, maybe self. This is what she did before the war. This is exactly what caused her to stay alive in the ghetto in Lodz, because this is what she did in Lodz. It is not surprising then that in the DP camp she decided to be a seamstress and studied at the old school in the camp. And here are her notebook and even the diploma from the old school in Bergen-Belsen. When she made an aliyah and came to Israel, she continued to work as a seamstress her entire life. Bucha, if I may be poetic, is weaving the tapestry of her life. And more than that, one brings into the crisis what he is. And another example. Andor Komanster, later on changed his name to Aharon Kamir, was born in Budapest. He lived in Romania, and during the war spent 2 years in the Luaga forced labor camp in Romania. Before the war, he worked as a barber. And in the camp he also worked as a barber, but now for the Romanian officers. Komenster managed to escape from Luaga in a wagon loaded with corpses, holding his suitcase containing his hairdressing tools. This one. In 1944, he traveled from Romania to Turkey, then via Lebanon to Israel. And what do you think he did in his early years in Israel? Of course, Aaron made a living as a traveling barber, cutting hair at clients' homes all over Israel, using the same suitcase and tools he escaped with from Luaga, adding a few during the years. His son, Yossi Kamir, gave the suitcase and all of its context to Yad Vashem at a collection day in this Gathering the Fragments campaign in Netanya. One brings into the crisis what he is, even very, very practically. Let's take another example. This is a Jewish calendar. What is so special about the calendar? Well, the context, of course, the context in that case, of course, is again essential. It was prepared by someone, his name was Mendel Hershtik, he was born in Romania, he was brought to a labor camp again, in that case, labor camp, the name of the labor camp was Yelaya. He knew by heart the algorithms, the rules, in order to create a Jewish calendar. It is complicated, not so many people know to do it. He knew it by heart. So when he is there in the camp, he is opening a class. He is a teacher, so he's opening a class and also writes from the memory the whole calendar for 46 years, from 19,000 to 1946. I don't know why. I have no clue. But this is what he's doing. It's a very, very big book, notebook. This is the first page. Now, in a place where a person is dehumanized and detached from his previous existence, the calendar allows him to bring human order to his life. He knows when Shabbat is and when it is a holiday, and in this way controls at least one thing, the sense of time. The calendar imparts meaning and identity to time, knowing that today is Tuesday, knowing that today is Tuesday is what keeps you a human being, knowing that today is Hanukkah keeps your Jewish identity. So when the calendar gets into our collections, when it gets to Yad Vashem, it may meet dozens of similar calendars, because we have a lot. Like, for example, this one that was made in Buchenwald, in this case by my father's uncle. Now the context is much deeper. It is not a single case. It is a phenomenon. Another example. This is a prayer book written by Hannah Weiss from Satu Mare, known to us as Satmer. She was sent with her family to the ghetto in Siget, from there to Auschwitz, and later to Zomerda camp, a sub camp of Buchenwald. There she worked in the munitions factory. Recently, she donated to Yad Vashem this prayer book, which she wrote from memory on scraps of paper used for wrapping the weapons parts manufactured in the factory. She wrote the prayer book in Hebrew, but in Hungarian scripts, letters, and even added a few personal prayers and requests. Sidur, this is written here, but in Hungarian, on the cover. When we received the prayer book and researched its history, our experts in the artifacts collection discovered that we had in our collection another prayer book that we received many years ago, and it was from the same camp, written by another lady, girl actually. Her name was Dita Kirchner. Dita was raised in a secular home and was sent to the Zomerda camp as many other young girls in her age. She believed that no Jews would survive the Shoah, and therefore it was important to her to write a prayer book so that there would remain a memory of Judaism. She stole stickers from ammunition crates and wrote on them prayers that she heard from a woman named Clary Kahana when she prayed. She was standing near her and wrote what she had heard from her praying. Clary Kahana was killed just before the liberation by a mortar shell during a death march, while Dita and her mother survived and were liberated in Leipzig. Again, when one artifact, in this case Chaya Weiss's prayer book, meets another artifact, Dita Kirchner's prayer book, then 1 + 1 does not equal 2, but much more. From a single instance, we learn about the phenomena, an entire story, complex and multi-layered. And the same, and I'm going back to the example that I gave you before, the same with Gantberger's memorial book. Remember that book. Well, one day, an expert from the archives came to me and told me, I found something that I'm sure will shed light on the content of Gantberger's book. And what she showed me was this memory book that was done for Clara Hess to her 50th birthday on November 1939. Her friends gave her this book as a gift. She was from Chernowitz, a nearby place. One of them wrote to her in German. This is the first page. When we translate the line, this is the translation. Memory is the only paradise in which one cannot be expelled. The German version is the key for the whole issue. It is a line from a well-known German poet, Jean Paul, from the 18th century, admired by, or known, familiar to educated European youngsters. So Gantberger actually didn't invent the sentence, but had a dialogue with the European culture and converted it into his Hebrew writing, into his Jewish identity. Now the context is much deeper. It is not a single case, it is deeper, it has layers in it. If you want to follow my examples, you have to take into account the complexity. You have to ask yourselves, in what way your interpretations are connected to the correct context? Are we reliable, using accurate facts? What do we present in our story? What is the right balance between a story of horror and a story of life inside the chaos? It also requires humility, because we have no notion of what people interpret and take from what we say. We have no idea what each of you, I have no idea what each of you hear in my words now. On the one hand, a great burden of responsibility is placed on what we say, but on the other hand, it demands humility, requiring us to not only speak, but to listen. And I have to admit that in our case, especially in my own case, it has a specific meaning to our own identity, and allow me to be personal. My father is a Holocaust survivor. He didn't tell his story ever to us, even when I worked at Yad Vashem, because he claimed he's not a Holocaust survivor at all. He stayed only in France, not in the camps in the East, so he's not a Holocaust survivor. We knew that he had a story, but we didn't know what is the story. When I entered the archives, when I started to work in the archives, I asked my father I tried at least to ask my father to deliver a testimony. I told him, you know, one of the departments in the archives is the oral history department. I know that you are not a Holocaust survivor, but I want to test you, technically, they know to work. Are you interested in being interviewed? He played the game, and he agreed. It took me half a year to send a team. So a few years ago, a team was sent to him. Usually, we're sending a team for 3 hours in average. In his case, it was 3 meetings, 10 hours all in all, because he had a story. His father was a Hasidic Rebbe. They traveled from Poland to Belgium before the war. He became a rabbi in Brussels. They escaped from Brussels to France, from France to Spain. Was caught, was released by Righteous Among the Nations, a Dutch priest. Then he was in an orphanage, etc., etc. A nice long story. My father knows how to tell the story, and he also has an excellent memory. This was only listening to his testimony today in the Yad Vashem archives and in the visual center here at Yad Vashem. For me, was the first time, while working in the archives only a few years ago, to learn about my father's own story. And I'm not ignorant. I work at Yad Vashem, I'm a historian, I'm an educator, but still. Only then, a few months later, he came to me and told me, no, Haim, you were correct. I'm indeed a Holocaust survivor. My story is worth telling. Now I want to tell the story to my best friends, and you'll video it. You'll take the video, which I did the same day. A few weeks ago, my daughter, who is an officer in the IDF, came to him without any notice and told him, would you like to tell the story to my soldiers in the army? So he said yes. So she took him, traveled with him, and for her and the rest of the family, because she took the rest of the kids, it was the first time that they have heard from him the story. And when we did it, we realized that here in the archives you have more information when you start to ask to understand how much we don't know. So for example, I told you that he was immigrating from Poland to Brussels. In the police files, you find the immigration file. This is the immigration file of the family. This is the first photo that I have from my father, that he has from his childhood, because they had to fill it out. The father is not here because he immigrated a year before. When you ask questions, you start to understand, when you start to negotiate, to converse with your own identity, your own history, you understand how much you don't understand. So in our case, it is not only an interesting issue, it is us. So if we want all that we collect and research and know to be relevant, we have to relate to the void that the Shoah created. We also need to create the free space, the void between our students and us, the place where we converse, the conversation with ourselves, with our students, with the public, is our next big challenge. I'm talking about a modern midrash of a document, a midrash of an object, a midrash of a picture, midrash of a monument, no less than a midrash of words. A midrash that we will remember. And memory, you all know now, is the only paradise from which one cannot be expelled. Thank you.
Haim, יישר כוח. And a personal story as well. So you have to work at Yad Vashem. Then we get all the stories. I'd like to invite Dr. David Silberklang. David is a senior historian at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem, an editor of the scholarly journal Yad Vashem Studies, as well as Syria's editor of the Holocaust Survivors Memory Project. He teaches Jewish history at the University of Haifa's International Graduate Program in Holocaust Studies and at the Rothberg International School of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. David has published widely on the Holocaust, and his book, Gates of Tears, The Holocaust in the Lublin District, was a finalist for the Yad Vashem International Book Prize in Holocaust Research. David received his BA from Columbia University, MA and PhD from the Hebrew University. David.
Thank you very much, Ephraim, for that introduction. And after you get an introduction like that, the best thing to do is not to say anything, because it can only make it worse. But I'll do my best anyway. I'd like to begin my talk today with a story from the Lublin district, of course, the area that I researched the most, although there's some others that I've looked at. And I'd like to begin with Rabbi Tzvi Elimelech Talmud. So how do we advance to the next? I've got a pointer. I just did it. I didn't do anything. Okay. You know, I do have a PowerPoint, but I'm really, as my kids would say, more of a piece of history than a historian. Anyway, that's what they tell me. I want to begin then with a story that begins with Rabbi Tzvi Elimelech Talmud. Rabbi Tzvi Elimelech Talmud, known among his family and friends as Hirsch Melech, was, as far as I know, the last rabbi in the city of Lublin during the Holocaust, and the time that this story takes place, in April of 1942. And in April of 1942, Rabbi Talmud performed a wedding on April the 17th, as far as we know. Oops, went the wrong way. And the wedding was of the man whose, this is his business card, Shammai Greyer. Shammai Greyer was a professional barber. He was also in Lublin before the war and during the war. He also was a petty criminal in Lublin before the war. And during World War II, for a variety of reasons, he was arrested by the German police early in the occupation. And then he was released, and he became apparently an informer of some sort to the Germans. And in the course of that, the Germans gave him, as a gift for his cooperation with them, a cafe. And that is his business card regarding his cafe, which was located on Lubartowska Street in the Lublin ghetto, outside the ghetto than inside the ghetto. On April 17th, 1942 then, Rav Talmud performed a wedding. Shammai Greyer was going to marry his mistress, a teenage girl aged 17 named Mira Fishman. She was a refugee who had been deported with her parents in 1940, in February 1940, from Stettin. Stettin was Germany before World War II. Today it is Szczecin, a city in western Poland, according to the borders of today. Greyer was in his 40s. He was a married man. His wife was named Bella. He wanted to get divorced from his wife Bella. She refused, and as we all know, in Jewish law and halakha, you can't grant a divorce if the wife refuses. And somehow a deal was struck with Rav Talmud. Perhaps he was coerced, that would be my guess. And in the end, Rav Talmud granted the divorce and performed the wedding. There was a chuppah, there was a rabbi, there were 2 witnesses. Mira Fishman's parents were there. They were very displeased that their teenage, underage daughter had had an affair with a middle-aged man, and she was pregnant at the chuppah.
How much more?
But there's a divorce and there's a wedding, by some standards, according to Jewish tradition. And the deputy commander of the Gestapo of the Lublin district, a man named Dr. Harry Sturm, sent a huge bouquet of white roses for the couple to the wedding. The same Harry Sturm, I might add, a few months later, on November the 9th of 1942, when the Lublin ghetto was liquidated, also made sure that he took care of Shammai Greyer and Mira Fishman and their newborn baby daughter himself when he shot them all in the head. Now, this is a bizarre story. This wedding that took place, a rabbi performing a wedding that clearly, with a divorce and the wedding, clearly is uncomfortable with the whole story. But at the same time, in this bizarre story that took place shortly after the conclusion of the deportation of 30,000 Jews from Lublin to Belzec, the Belzec extermination camp. And these are the first Jews deported to Belzec. So in the terrible atmosphere after that deportation, and this wedding took place and the divorce only a day or two before, an additional 3,000 or 4,000 Jews were taken out of Lublin among the remainder of the Jews there and marched to a woods several kilometers away from Lublin and shot in the Krempitz woods just outside of Lublin. In this bizarre, murderous situation, we have this wedding and this divorce taking place. And I would say then that this raises questions. So what was Jewish identity in the Lublin district or anywhere during the Shoah? And I would say that clearly there's Jewish identity here. Greyer wanted the divorce. He wanted to have a get. Greyer wanted to have a chuppah. Apparently Mira Fishman did as well. There's a rabbi, there are witnesses. But it's bizarre. It is not the way things are normally done. When we look for Jewish identity during the Shoah, we're looking for it here today. I'll be discussing the Lublin district during the Holocaust. We have to look, of course, in obvious places, things like religious observance, sticking to the tradition and the customs, efforts to do that. We have to look at education, at Jewish political activity, underground, at Jewish underground newspapers and things like that all reflect Jewish identity. But we also have to look at things that are not so obvious and kind of scratch the surface and look between the lines when we're looking for evidence of challenges to Jewish identity and how Jews try to deal with those challenges, such as the story of this very strange wedding. Now, we can find, of course, many stories during the Shoah of Jews who did everything they possibly could to maintain identity, religious identity or secular identity, whatever their Jewish identity was, and they did everything they could, if it's a religious identity, to eat kosher food or to observe holidays, to try to have a minyan in order to pray. And of course there were stories like that, many stories like that. However, I would suggest that we not get carried away and try to assume or guess that, in general, most Jews were trying to do everything they could to observe Jewish traditions and Jewish law all the time. That would be an idealized version of what Jews did and how they coped or tried to cope with the challenges to Jewish identity. And I would say we need to look for Jewish identity among Jews in other ways and in different places, and not only in those obvious things. Those obvious things as well, they're there, but not only there. And let me say something about the Lublin district. The Lublin district, the area that the Nazis defined as the Lublin district in the Generalgouvernement, the general government of Poland, as the Nazis called it, during the Holocaust, was an area that had, as far as we know, 115 organized Jewish communities, kehilot. Each of them had at least 100 Jews and was officially recognized before World War II as a community. In addition to that, there were hundreds of localities in the Lublin district where there was villages, where there were maybe only 1 or 2 or 3 Jewish families. And in all of these places in the Lublin district, as far as I've been able to discover, there was no place that had any regular, organized Jewish religious activity. There was a lot of religious activity underground, but most of it was private. There were no regular Shabbat or holiday prayer services. There was no Jewish educational system. There were no communal efforts after the first few months of occupation at organizing kosher food or anything else that was similar in terms of maintaining Jewish tradition. So on the one hand, we can look at this place and perhaps say there's a place where Jewish identity collapsed and Jewish communal activity collapsed, as perhaps Yehuda Bauer was discussing in his talk. There were no schools, no youth movements, except for one particular case of a hachshara, a training area, a Zionist training area that operated for a few months in the southern part of the district and brought together young Zionists from all over Poland. But that was a brief episode. There were no synagogues that functioned after the very early part of the occupation. Most holidays and Shabbat observances were forbidden. It was simply impossible to observe, and no kosher slaughter and all of that. But at the same time, we have many reflections of Jewish identity. And what I want to do is look at reflections of how Jews tried to cope and maintain identity. What did that mean under these extreme circumstances in 4 particular aspects of identity? One I will look at is education and culture. When I say culture, I mean culture other than religious culture, because that will be a separate subject, religion. Looking at food, looking at attempts to observe holidays and manage to organize, if possible, a minyan so that people could pray in a minyan, in a quorum, and at writing. We have to understand that in the Lublin district, as in many other places, in occupied Poland and in other parts of Europe, but especially in occupied Poland, especially in the Lublin district, the main issue that Jews dealt with was refugees. In the Lublin district, by the time we enter the beginning of 1941, at least 1/3 of the Jews living in the Lublin district, 1/3 of around 250 or 300,000 Jews, were refugees from other places. In addition to that, there were many, many thousands of Jews, we don't have an exact number, but it's certainly many thousands, if not tens of thousands of Jews who were from the Lublin district, but were not living in their own homes. So that they were, in a sense, internal refugees. They're still in their general area where they come from, but they are refugees as well. And therefore, what we find is that the Jewish communities of the Lublin district were dealing primarily with problems of refugees, trying to feed them, trying to house them, trying to clothe them, trying to keep them alive. While they also, of course, were trying to keep themselves alive. What this meant was that with the meager resources that were left for the Jews in Lublin, of course, the Nazis took Jews' resources there as they did elsewhere. So with the meager resources that remained for the Jews and the Jewish communities of Lublin, of the Lublin district, there was little room for worrying about things other than the very basic needs of physical existence. In the Lublin city itself, where there was a very active Jewish council, a Judenrat, which was composed of pre-war Jewish leaders. Very special case, where nearly every member of the Judenrat had actually been a pre-war member of the community council, of the Kehillah. And those few who were not members of the pre-war council had been members of other aspects of Jewish communal leadership, in education or in other aspects of Jewish life. Yet what we find in the Lublin Judenrat is that there was no education department. There was no department for religious or cultural affairs. And within the Lublin district, there were no underground newspapers. There was almost no underground Zionist activity, and so on and so on. They're occupied with something else. It is interesting, there's a whole story behind it that I won't get into now, but the entire, as far as we can tell, the entire archive of the Lublin Jewish Council during the war, the Lublin Judenrat, survived the Holocaust. It is one of the only cases where an entire archive of a Jewish community during the war survived. It's 182 files. The originals are in Lublin. We have copies here at Yad Vashem. Of the 182 files, only one addresses education. And it's a very small file, indeed. Not because they didn't care, but because of the circumstances that they faced. We know that in Lublin, the last time the Jews were officially permitted to pray in a synagogue, that is, to use a synagogue for prayer, was during the high holidays in 1939, in other words, at the beginning of the occupation. And when that was done in the city of Lublin, the German occupying forces dragged Jews out of the synagogue and publicly humiliated them. And after that experience, and after synagogues were forbidden to be used as synagogues, we know that there was ongoing prayer and efforts at prayer, and even minyanim, sometimes on a Shabbat and sometimes on holidays, but these things were done secretly. In general, most of Jewish life, whether it was religious or educational, ended up becoming very private. Things people did in their home, in the privacy of their families, because communal activity in these things became almost impossible and often punishable. When we look at cultural activity in the Lublin district in general, as I said, there was far less cultural activity, not only before the war, than in certain other places in Poland. Certainly, there was far less cultural activity collectively in the Lublin district than in the Warsaw Ghetto. Part of the reason for this is that many of the Jewish leaders fled eastward. Lublin is very close to the demarcation line between Germany and the Soviet Union. Many of the leaders fled eastward, and that left, except for the Judenrat of Lublin itself, that left a certain leadership gap. And a lot of the leaders of youth movements fled eastward as well, so they're not there. That's part of the reason. But part of the problem here also was something that was much more, I would say, an objective difficulty, and that was that the houses, even in the city of Lublin, where the Jews lived, were small houses. And in the smaller communities, the small shtetl, and in the small villages, the houses were very small, yet everywhere a curfew was imposed. What that meant was that for people to get together and organize something, a discussion, a study session, a political activity of some sort, writing some underground newspaper, they had to meet. In order to meet, they had to walk out of their homes and go to another home. They had to find a place to meet. The buildings themselves were mostly 1, 2, or 3-story buildings. Very few people lived there. What that meant was that when a curfew is imposed, and the penalty for being caught outside of curfew is severe, and from the fall of 1941, it is instant death, then the very curfew in those physical circumstances means that you can't organize such activity unless you're going to risk your life every single day. And Jews risk their lives, but they risk their lives in the Lublin district trying to maintain refugees and trying to make sure that people stayed alive, rather than for things like that generally. Jewish schools all over Poland were closed down by the German civilian authorities as soon as they took over from the occupying military forces in October of 1939. And in the Lublin district, schools were not permitted to be open until there was a window of opportunity. On September 11th, 1940, the head of the general government, Hans Frank, issued an order that he backdated to August 31st of 1940, permitting Jewish communities to open technical schools and primary schools under very strict limitations in coordination with the German and the Polish educational authorities. Within the Lublin district, the people who had been involved in education before the war immediately jumped into action. And they did a survey, first in the city of Lublin. How many teachers do we have? How many children do we have? And they found that they had, at that point in time, late 1940, early 1941, 127 trained teachers just in the city of Lublin, and approximately 5,000 children of primary school age. They went to the Judenrat, and they told the Judenrat, you're not doing enough to try to organize education. You must do more. You must intervene with the German authorities. They've given you a window of opportunity. The Judenrat then turned to the Krakow Judenrat, which had already begun to organize Jewish educational activity. And the Krakow Judenrat, this is a letter that they sent to Lublin on January 24th, 1939, sent the Lublin Judenrat some advice on how to organize education. The Lublin Judenrat followed through, preparing curricula that they were going to present to the German and Polish educational authorities. The German educational authority was a man named Professor Kindler, who was the chief of education in the whole Generalgouvernement. They also had to deal with Mr. Krupchak, who was the Polish superintendent of education in the Lublin district. They identified the Beis Yaakov school building in Lublin as the first building they would use for a school, except that then there was a major influx of refugees that the Nazis sent into the Lublin district in February and March of 1941 from Western Poland and from Vienna. Many thousands and thousands of Jews, increasing the refugee problem, and they ended up filling the Beis Yaakov building with refugees instead of with school children. But they kept looking, and they presented ideas, and these are among the ideas they received from the Krakow Judenrat and their educational advice. And I won't go into all the details, but one thing that is clear, both in the Polish version and in the Hebrew versions of this, you see that there's a Hebrew heading to that particular document, is that they were looking at having education that was not only the tools of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also Jewish education. There is time there devoted to Jewish studies. The most ambitious curriculum that they came up with was for 36 hours of education for grades 3 to 7, half of which would be devoted to Jewish subjects. This never happened. The Polish educational director, the superintendent Krupchak, was unwilling to return to the Jews one of their school buildings that had meanwhile become a Polish school building. The previous one was the boys' curriculum. This is the girls' curriculum that they're recommending. He was refused to hand over a building. No building was available. The Germans were really not interested in giving this to the Jews. And then in March and April and May of 1941, there was a wave of ghettoization in the Lublin district. There had not been many ghettos until then, but now there's a wave of ghettoization in the city of Lublin, in the city of Zamość, and a few other places, and all of a sudden there are more refugees, people being moved around, and of course the education issue fell by the wayside. And informal education through youth movements and things like that never got off the ground. What about food? On the one hand, we know that in the Lublin district, precisely because there were almost no ghettos until a very late stage, the physical condition of the Jews in general was far better than the two ghettos about which we know the most, Warsaw and Lodz. Jews were hungry, but they were not starving to death. And until Jews were put into ghettos, in Lublin, in Radzin, and a few other places in the spring of 1941, there were no epidemic diseases. In 1940 and the beginning of 41, the death rate in the Lublin district among Jews was only very slightly higher than the death rate prior to World War II. So they're living in very tight circumstances, with very severe restrictions, with death threats hanging over their heads from the Germans. But they're not starving to death or dying of diseases. Yet at the same time, they're very hungry, and they're trying to supplement their food supply. Because there were so few ghettos, the German authorities turned a blind eye to the Jews leaving their communities sometimes, having contact with Polish farmers and buying food ostensibly on the black market, but essentially if the Jews get more food, then the Germans don't have to worry about them and don't have to worry about feeding them too much. And that's essentially what happened. There were attempts at kosher slaughter for the first few months of the occupation, but then it was stopped because it was too dangerous. And in March of 1941, all the remaining cows in the possession of the Jews in the Lublin district, and some people had cows, particularly the rural Jews, all of those were confiscated. Parallel to that, we know that the Joint Distribution Committee in the United States, until the U.S. entered the war, was sending food and other supplies to Jews all over occupied Europe, and that included the Lublin district. And when food would arrive, the Jewish social self-help, social welfare organization, JSS in its English acronym, or YISO in its Yiddish name, Yiddish acronym, would distribute the food, and there were representatives distributing the food. Here I have on the board, I apologize for the poor quality of the scan. I didn't have time to go to the archive and get a better scan. But what you see here is the first page of a document that is several pages long about food distribution in the Lublin district based upon a new shipment of food that was received at the end of May of 1941 with money that came from the Joint. And I have the first page because if you look at the very top of the first page, you will see that what they're distributing, among other things, is 1,250 kilograms of meat. According to the document, there was an estimated 120,000 very needy people in the Lublin district at that time. About half of them were refugees, about half were local people. So the 1,250 kilograms of meat for the coming month was being distributed among 120,000 people. What that comes to is 10 grams of meat per person for the month. Not very much. However, when you look at what kind of meat it is, you'll see that that's not exactly what happened. Because what they're distributing is smoked pig meat. If you can make it out over there. Smoked pig meat, which meant that, of course, there were Jews, even if they were observant Jews, who because of the conditions of hunger would eat that meat because there's no choice. There were Jews who were secular, of course, who had no problem eating that meat. But there were also Jews who were religious. We don't know how many, but we do know that they were there based on survivor accounts telling us what was going on. We know that there were Jews who were there who refused to eat the meat despite the hunger, and despite the fact that maybe because of the pikuach nefesh, because of the threat to life, they would be allowed to, they still would refuse to eat it because, after all, it's pig meat, which meant that some people had more than 10 grams, and other people had nothing. The food then was one of the major issues, and despite the problems of food, we still know that there was no starvation, even when they didn't take the pig meat. Or we get, whoops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. We get to the holidays. For that, there isn't a slide yet. I want to be brief about the holidays because the time is running out. But what we know is that on the one hand, the German civilian authorities, they're in charge, outlawed the observance of holidays, of Jewish holidays, and of Shabbat during the entire period of the Nazi occupation, during the entire Shoah in the Lublin district. At the same time, they turned a blind eye or gave specific permission to observe certain things. The blind eye was turned sometimes for high holiday services, Yom Kippur in the prisoner of war camp in Lipowa 7 in Lublin or in other places. The one holiday that for some reason German civilian authorities were particularly flexible about was Pesach. And we know that in 1940 and in 1941 and again in 1942, the Lublin Judenrat turned to the German civilian authorities and asked to have a special consignment of flour given to them so that they could bake matzah for Pesach. And in each of those 3 years, the German civilian authorities agreed. And in 1940 and in 1941, the Lublin Judenrat was able to hire certain bakeries, Jewish bakeries in Lublin, and they were assigned with baking the matzah. People who were too poor to pay for the matzah would get it for free, and people who had money would purchase it, and with what they paid, they were subsidizing the poor. And in that way, people were able to have a little bit of matzah for Pesach. In 1942, it didn't work like that, because the first Seder was on April 1st, but the deportations to Belgium began on March the 17th, which meant that the Jews who were still alive in Lublin, in the halfway point of that deportation operation, April 1st, were either dead or were hiding somewhere trying to evade deportations. And Pesach and baking matzah wasn't exactly what was occupying them at that point. Yet we know that there were successes among Jews in organizing Pesach Seders in various places, such as the Buzin forced labor camp in 1944, with the assistance of a German guard who took a bribe to help them bake matzah, or in the Demblin forced labor camp in 1943, where the Jewish head of the forced labor camp happened to know the German who was in charge of the forced labor camp, who was a military officer, and they had fought together in World War I in the Austrian army. Or in other places, there were some successes in organizing some holidays, and even in organizing minyanim. But I want to bring this to a conclusion by having a brief look at one other thing that I think highlights some of the aspects of Jewish identity that are the less obvious. And that is in writing. If you go to the Vashem archive, of course Haim knows this far, far better than I know. If you go to the Vashem archive, you'll find many, many, many thousands of letters and postcards and telegrams that Jews wrote to each other, or sometimes to people who are not Jewish. Some of those were sent through legal means, quote unquote, through whatever the Germans allowed, and lots of that was sent clandestinely, through couriers. What I have on the board here is one of those clandestine letters. It's from the Ringelblum archive, the Onik Shabbos or Onik Shabbat archive from the Warsaw Ghetto. It is a letter that was written by a Jew, we don't know who, in Włodawa in eastern Poland, very close to the death camp of Sobibor, to someone or a group of people in Warsaw on June the 1st of 1942. It was handwritten, I typed this, but it was handwritten, and it was filed within the archive. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, say something about how this is written, and then actually read this, it's not that long, read this letter with you, and look at an excerpt from one other letter. This particular letter, like many things that are written by Jews during the Holocaust, includes what we might call shibutzim, that is, insertions of quotations, whether exact quotations or somewhat changed quotations from Tanakh, from the Bible, or from Mishnah or Gemara, that are inserted into the regular writing in order to say something that the person wants to say, either in the exact meaning of the original quotation, or in some changed meaning, or in the opposite meaning. That is, the quotation says one thing, I mean the opposite of what it says. This particular letter is actually rather simple in terms of what it says, and I want to read it with you. Now, Włodawa, there were 5,000 Jews approximately in Włodawa prior to this letter being written. On May 22nd and May 23rd, which that year was the Shavuot holiday, about 1/3 of them were deported to Sobibor. This person who writes had evaded the deportation. And he writes, "We are, thank God, healthy. We don't know what to do regarding going to the doctor. We can't decide ourselves, although we had already decided to be by the doctor. Since uncle wants, chas v'shalom, God forbid, to have his children's party by you, God forbid, because he's renting an apartment near you, very near to you, perhaps you don't even know this, therefore, I am writing to you now, and we're sending you this information specially so you should know. So the doctor and the uncle, of course, are the Nazis. And uncle wants to have a party for his children. But it's not a real party, of course, but it's a God forbid party. Right? God forbid he should have this party by you like he had by us, a party of murdering Jews. It is true that you too should rent apartments out of town. Michutz la'ir, he wrote in Hebrew. Out of town for all our brothers, the children of Israel. He has already prepared a new apartment for everyone. So the apartment here is two things. You should be in an apartment out of town that is run away. And he, the uncle, the Nazis, have prepared or are preparing an apartment for you. A new one for everyone. The same one he had near us. In case you perhaps don't know of this, I'm writing especially so you'll know. Because uncle wants Vayigaresh et ha'adam. Haim and I didn't coordinate that. Vayigaresh et ha'adam, he expelled man. You recognize the quotation from Bereshit, from Genesis, when God expelled Adam and Eve, man, from the Garden of Eden. Uncle wants to expel you. And then you will be together, God forbid, with Shlomo Velvel, alav shalom, of blessed memory. Now, I don't know who Shlomo Velvel was, if that was a real person that the writer and the recipient knew who had passed away, or if Shlomo Velvel was an invented name. That's not the relevant point here. The relevant point here, of course, is alav shalom. If you don't get out of town, you will be of blessed memory, which of course you don't want. We know with certainty that uncle will soon complete the apartment by you. You should know, perhaps you can figure something out. It should be generally known that uncle wants, God forbid, to have a wedding reception soon by you. And the apartment is already prepared, very near to you. You know, in Yiddish, a wedding reception, a chassanet, means literally a wedding reception, right? You're making a wedding for your children or something like that. But it also means a big to-do. Either don't make a big deal out of it, or it's just a big to-do. So when this person writes that uncle wants chas v'sholom to machen a chasanet, he wants, God forbid, to make a chasanet, a wedding reception by you, then he's making a big to-do. And the apartment is already prepared, very near to you. Remember, be in your apartments outside town at all costs, so that you won't be with Shlomo Velvel of blessed memory. And for sleeping, the only sgula, the only good fortune, is that of he who sits secretly, Yoshev B'Seter. And here they're turning, of course, that Perek Tehillim, that psalm around, because Yoshev B'Seter Elyon does not go high. It's being in the graces of God's protection. That's not what's happening here. The only good fortune is he who sits secretly, who hides. Remember well that we are holy, or we are martyrs. It's the same word in Hebrew. We are kiddushim. V'hanotam mimenu ad boker v'chule. And that which is left for morning, etc. The person wrote, etc. I imagine many of you recognize that pasuk, right, from Parshat Bo. From the first, the story of the Israelites leaving Sinai, leaving Egypt and going to Sinai, the first Pesach that they celebrate, and they're told you have to eat that Pesach sacrifice quickly, with your cloak on, with your walking stick ready and your wallet ready, because you have to leave quickly in the morning, so eat quickly. And the pasuk says, and that which is left for morning, what you didn't eat, hanotam mimenu ad boker, ba'esh tisrof. It will be burned by fire. The person writing this knew that the recipient understood those hints that were brought from the sources. Vayigaresh Adam, and he expelled man. Yoshev B'Seter, someone who hides. And that particular verse which he didn't even end. Which he knew the recipient speaks the same language, understands the same sources, and is trying to get a message across. We don't know who sent or who received. I couldn't tell you for sure what happened to the writer or the recipient. However, no one has ever come forward. This is not the first time this letter is being publicized. No one has ever come forward saying, oh yes, I had something to do with that. The last thing I want to look at, in the last few minutes available, goes back to Rav Talmud, the person I started with. Rav Talmud, among other things, was known before World War II in Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin as an expert in making calendars. Here too, we didn't coordinate. An expert in making calendars. If I had known what Haim was doing, I would have showed you the entire calendar now. And just before Rosh Hashanah, in September of 1942, during the month of Elul, he sat down by memory, by hand, and wrote out a calendar for the year 5703. 1942-43. He wrote out a calendar in fine detail. Now, he was really an expert. There are different ways of calculating when exactly do you light candles on Friday, on the eve of Shabbat, or on the eve of a holiday. And you might find, if you take different Jewish calendars, that one will say, for this Shabbat, it's 403 or 405 or 407, and the Shabbat might end also with a gap of a few minutes, because there are different ways of calculating. He knew all the customs. And for every single time that candles needed to be lit, he had 5 different lighting times, depending which custom you observe, all from memory, knowing, as Haim said, the algorithms that were necessary. And once he wrote it out, he then had it typed. He managed to have a Hebrew typewriter hidden in the remnant ghetto of Lublin, typed it out, and had it run off on a mimeograph machine. Several copies have survived and are in the Lublin Judenrat archive, and we have copies here at Vashem. The copies here are not the physical copy, but of course the digital copy. Rabbi Talmud also wrote letters. This is one of his letters, which he also wrote by hand and had typed. I don't know if he typed it or someone typed it for him, but it's typed. And there's some typographic letters. You look at what he wrote, look at what he typed. Here and there is a letter that's a mistake, but of course, that's because he's a human being, so of course there's going to be a mistake. He couldn't use word spell check. Now, the writing is beautiful Hebrew. You can't really maybe make it out in this dense page, but the writing is beautiful rabbinic Hebrew, full of those shibutzim. And I want to share with you this last known letter from him, written either on or just after Shmini Atzeret, the end of the Jewish holidays in that year. That's the beginning of October of 1942. I'll put a lot on the screen, but I'm only going to read a few sentences to share some of what he had to say about Jewish identity, being a Jew, and what his last wish was. The letter here was written, it says 5742, it should be 5703 actually. It's a complete mistake on my part. 5703. Not his mistake, my mistake. And he wrote to a friend named Haim Berglas, who was hiding somewhere in Pinchuv. Neither one of these people survived. We have records of that. Greetings to you, my dear friend, who is close to my heart, crown of the Torah, Rav Chaim Aryeh Berglas. May you be blessed with life. Your letter arrived when you sent it, and I fully confess and do not hesitate to say that I have sinned against you in my silence until now. So this correspondence going on clandestinely. Yet it is not like me to sit quietly and not take pen to hand, especially in these trying days. But the days of Ratzon, that is the period of the high holidays, the days of Ratzon that we experience were my time to prepare to be a Shaliach Tzibur, so that my prayer would be as familiar to my lips as an elder and experienced one. He's taking the prayer of the cantor, the leader of the services, before the Musaf prayer on the high holidays, as he prays to God, God, let my prayers be heard and clear to you as an elder and experienced one. And he's saying that about himself. Since I've never been a Shaliach Tzibur before a congregation on the high holidays, and so on. So he's writing to him and he's telling him about the high holidays. One of the things that he talks about is his correspondence with other rabbis. He mentions many. I just put one on the board, the Rebbe of Boyan, Rav Moshe Friedman, who was very well known as someone who engaged extensively in tzedakah activity, even during the war, as he himself was starving to death and had been taken from his home, was living in a ghetto that wasn't in his own place. And he says, I received a letter from him on Shmini Atzeret, now, just before I wrote to you, Rav Berglas. And he tells him what's happening with Rav Friedman and about the wonderful things that this rabbi has been doing. And I won't go into the details, but I can provide you with the letter. He talks about what's happened to other communities and how they're being destroyed. In this case, the community of Warsaw. In other words, he's informed. The Warsaw Ghetto deportations had ended on September 21st. The great deportation to Treblinka. Here he's writing in the beginning of October, and he knows. And he goes on also to complain to God. Believe me, true friend closer than a brother, that it is very difficult to me to let out such things toward on high. I do fully believe that he, God, is the rock whose work is perfect and all his ways are just and true. But it is difficult for me. Under no circumstances can I reconcile myself to the thought that all of us are guilty and such sinners, that a flood of blood and fire and brimstone should sweep us away with the flow of the wrathful waters. And he talks about his family in that context as well. And he talks in detail about how people were killed, using the language of Rosh Hashanah in the middle of this section. And the rest, the people who are being killed, men, women, and children, go straight to death. Those who are not being selected for labor go straight to death by terrible tortures. Who by water, and who by fire, who by strangulation, and who by stoning. Straight out of the prayers, of course, Unatana Tokef, the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then he has a plea to God. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Lama yomru hagoyim ha'ena Elohehem. Make known among the nations and before our eyes your revenge for your servants' spilt blood. Let a Savior arise for Israel and extricate us from the depths. For if not now, when? If not at this moment when we have reached 49 gates of destruction, when will the Savior save and the rescuer rescue? Indeed, all has come to an end and we are not saved. He has a serious argument with God, but within faith. And then he goes on to inform his friend that everyone came to the services for the high holidays where he, Rav Talmud, was a Shaliach Tzibur. Even the radicals in the camp, who never whiffed the smell of public prayer. I imagine he means the Bundists and the communists. All diligently came to the prayer house, not only for Yizkor, but for the entire service. Did they all become religious all of a sudden? No. But this is a way to express your Jewishness and your Jewish identity by coming together, even if you're not religious. And similarly, we had an etrog in the 4 species, which I believe was one of the only ones in the whole country. How they got the Arba Minim for Sukkot in October of 1942, 5 weeks before the ghetto was liquidated and most of them were murdered, I have no idea. But they did. And I want to end with his last will and testament, where he writes, just before the section about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he writes, I would wish that at least some memory of us will remain, because we were, because our desire was to be useful and to be included, because our purpose was to mend the breaches of our time and to imbue it with a new spirit for life. I would wish that there would remain some memory of my name and that of my forefathers, of my only son whom I have loved as all the world, and from whom I had high hopes and anticipated great things. I would wish that at least this letter should remain as an everlasting memory, and in that I would be consoled, but that too is denied us. Our progeny and our name, they even destroy all the universe, and no one prevents them. And only the gates of tears have not been locked before us, and we are able and entitled to bemoan the destruction of our nation, to eulogize the rupture in our destroyed people, and to lead the river of our tears with us to the grave. This they cannot take from us. I would say that in that letter and letters like that, a letter imbued deeply with Jewish identity, even in the most extreme circumstances, and even in his dismay at God. Where is God? He's wondering, but God is there, I just don't understand. And even in complete despair, it's all over. he says. Deeply imbued with Jewish identity, but sometimes we have to look not in the usual places. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I want to thank Eyal, Yehuda, Haim, and David for inspiring presentations this morning.